So de Gaulle realised that the biggest challenge for the resistance was coordinating its efforts prior to the Allied invasion. In other words, that France simply would not be liberated by the efforts of the resistance alone. It would require an invasion of American and British forces to liberate France. And so what de Gaulle was trying to do in the meantime was trying to coordinate, especially the forces of empire, to see how they could help participate in any kind of French liberation. And also, of course, it was raising questions about, well, what was the future of the French Empire going to be? Britain, by 1943, had already promised India that after the war it would be granted independence. The Americans, in particular, were very eager that the French Empire be kind of taken apart, or that liberation be promised to various groups in or various members of the French Empire as well. And so de Gaulle was trying to strike this balance between, on the one hand, getting the help of the various colonized populations who were part of the French Empire, but also trying to preserve the French Empire and not lose it, that try and maintain its existence after the war. In fact, in some ways, the war had demonstrated the importance of the Empire to France, that had allowed some aspects of France to remain free from Nazi control. So in 1943, de Gaulle made a speech in Algiers, where he promised that after the war, he certainly didn't promise independence for Algeria, but suggested that more rights would be given to French-educated Muslims in Algeria, which essentially was the same proposals made by Léon Blum's government in 1937 that had been so bitterly opposed. But these reforms really weren't enough for many of the Algerian nationalists. So on the left we have here Farhat Abbas, who was member of what we call the Evoulé groups, those people who were considered evolved in French minds because they had adopted, learned French, had been educated through French. He had already concluded that France would never treat Algeria with the respect it deserved. And the man on the right, Masali Haj, was a Muslim nationalist who wanted Algerian independence, and he certainly rejected any kind of lukewarm French efforts at reform. So it was kind of obvious that de Gaulle could make these kind of promises, but for most people in Algeria, they simply weren't enough. And it suggested that after the war, Algeria was going to be a complicated problem for the French government, as it certainly was, as we will see in a later lecture. In 1944, de Gaulle organised a conference in Brazzaville, in what is today the capital of the Republic of Congo, to kind of address issues of the empire. So this is de Gaulle here pictured with Félix Eboulé, who said was the administrator of Chad. Firstly, independence for the colonies was kind of set aside. You see de Gaulle's quote here: the eventual creation, even in the distant future, of self-government for the colonies is best to be set aside. So basically, I don't want to discuss independence right now. Although he did understand that people like Eboulé were helping the French war effort on the premise that they certainly would have, if not full independence, greater say in how their colonies were governed going forward. And so that's what kind of de Gaulle was promising, a kind of vague idea that in future the colonies would have greater consultation, there would be greater measures of, not independent but semi-autonomous local government. Among the things he promised at the Brazzaville Congress were that the law of the indigenous, which had been introduced in 1881, which essentially allowed French colonial administrators to totally override the French constitution and impose whatever punishment they wanted on those people in the colonies who had broken the law, would be repealed. That forced labour, which happened sometimes in the French colonies, that would no longer be allowed to exist. That greater opportunities for education would be provided, although of course with the caveat that French education would be only through French. But it did give the colonies some sense of hope that yes, that things after war will be better. If and when France regains its independence, there will be an improvement in the situation for the colonies as well. So, of course, all of this is building up to an Allied invasion. That nothing can change until that happens. Here's your Jeopardy question. The largest seaboard invasion in history, the Allied landing in France on D-Day, June 6, 1944, was formerly known as this. What is Operation Overlord? So the large invasion of France takes place in June 1944. De Gaulle had moved French soldiers, had managed to create a French battalion and have it brought to the United Kingdom to participate in the invasion, which they did. But de Gaulle himself had no influence or say on the invasion. In fact, he was kept entirely in the dark about when it was due to take place. I believe actually de Gaulle was actually in the United States when the invasion began, visiting Roosevelt, and Roosevelt had told him absolutely nothing about this invasion. So he was certainly not directly involved in it. There had been efforts to some extent to try and coordinate efforts with the resistance to join in or help the Allies once they invaded France. Of course, this was beset with difficulties. The biggest difficulty was that the Allies, for obvious reasons, were not trying to give out a clear day for when they were planning to invade, and therefore the French resistance only had a hazy idea of when the Allied operation would begin and what it would entail. There were several uprisings across France when word of the Allied invasion got out, but sometimes it meant that the lightly armed local soldiers, the Maquis, pictured here, oftentimes were brutally suppressed by the Germans because they basically expected, immediate Allied help, Allied planes, Allied troops on the ground, and perhaps were not in their location. So one famous battle in around Grenoble, the Maquis of Vercors, many of them they took heavy casualties because they rebelled against Nazi rule and didn't realize that the Allies were not in a position to immediately help them based on their geographic location. And so, the people of France suffered in some ways with the invasion. Obviously, the Allies had been bombing France to soften up German defences, but that had the effect that it took civilian casualties as well. And once the Allies landed, the Nazis proved very willing to engage in vicious reprisals to suppress any French resistance efforts. One of the most famous came at the Oradour massacre, so shortly after the landings on D-Day. All the men and women in the village of Oradour, which was 642 people, were executed by the Nazis. So this picture here was of the school in Oradour, taken sometime between 1940 and 1944, I'm not sure the exact year. Basically, every person in that picture died during the massacre. So very, very brutal suppression of the French population. Another Jeopardy question for you guys. So, art and history. The famous tapestry depicted the famous actually depicting the Norman invasion of England in 1066 was made in this French town. What is Bayeux? The Bayeux Tapestry. That was one of the first towns liberated by the Allies in 1944, and de Gaulle quickly made his way to France to participate in these essentially to put himself front and center as the legitimate head of the French government. So he gave a famous speech at Bayeux, trying to rally the spirit of the people and present himself as the liberator of France. The difficulties with de Gaulle and the Allies kind of continued. Again, Franklin Roosevelt in particular didn't want de Gaulle to have much say or influence. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to establish a military government in France and then hold elections, and in some ways to try to sideline de Gaulle presenting himself as legitimate head of the French government. But once de Gaulle was on the ground in France, Roosevelt realised that was kind of quite difficult to do, and kind of grudgingly began to tolerate de Gaulle as a legitimate representative of the French government. De Gaulle also clashed with Dwight Eisenhower around military planning, and especially on the question of Paris. De Gaulle wasn't only trying to ensure that France would be treated with respect by the Allies, he was also very afraid of parts of the resistance. I mentioned in the earlier section, the resistance was heavily populated by communists, and de Gaulle was terrified that if he wasn't able to kind of get control of Paris quickly, that perhaps a communist takeover of France, led by the communist element of the resistance, would take place instead. So he insisted in summer of 1944, that Eisenhower conquer Paris. Eisenhower had been planning on bypassing Paris. He didn't consider Paris to be an important military target, but de Gaulle insisted and essentially threatened to kind of take his own army and break off from the Allies and attack Paris by himself if Eisenhower didn't help him. So Eisenhower kind of eventually relented and sent Allied units to Paris to try and liberate it from the Nazis. And so let me show you a video, a little video about the liberation of Paris itself.
As Allied troops sweep onwards towards Paris, a three-word announcement from the capital brings the great news: Paris is liberated. Cheering crowds line the streets as the Allies speed through the outskirts. The Union Jack flies beside those other flags that have been forbidden for 4 long years of Nazi rule. At the spearhead of the advance is General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division. And well in the picture are men of the FFI, whose comrades inside the city have helped to force the swaggering Germans to surrender. No wonder these French folk have gone wild with joy. Refugees who left Paris when street fighting flared up wait with their belongings to return to the city. The great moment arrives when General de Gaulle, who has stood as the symbol of free France through the dark years, sets foot in Paris again. General Leclerc, who led his 2nd French Division into the city, is also received with great enthusiasm. And there's a special welcome for General Koenig, head of the French forces of the interior, whose activities have caused Hitler so many sleepless nights.
So you see the scenes of liberation there during as Paris was freed from Nazi control. De Gaulle obviously put himself front and center of these celebrations. Actually, this is a picture of him marching towards Notre Dame Cathedral to participate in a celebratory mass. He was actually shot at on the way. I mean, the Nazis had not, and the Nazis and the militia, the French militia, had not totally abandoned the city by the time de Gaulle reached the city. What's interesting about the Paris itself is that Hitler had ordered that most of the public buildings in Paris be destroyed as part of the retreat, but the German commanding officer decided to ignore those orders, so Paris itself was actually largely spared the mass destruction that Hitler wanted to inflict upon it. So de Gaulle manages to get to Paris and kind of present himself as the legitimate head of the French provisional government. And the war, I mean, the Nazis evacuated the Vichy government to Germany. So Pétain, Laval, and those guys were taken to Germany. The Allies were obviously able to push the Nazis out of France completely by the end of 1944. So France has emerged as an independent nation state. And as the mopping up effort against the Nazis continued in 1945, de Gaulle began to prepare France for its second post-war reconstruction within a generation.